Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It started on an ordinary evening, like any other. I was standing by the window, watching the sun sink into the horizon, the faint hum of city life still drifting through the cracks in the walls. A usual moment of quiet before the night. But something was off. I had always been a person who valued routine. I liked the mundane, the predictable. It gave me a sense of control, which, now that I think about it, was probably the only thing keeping my mind from unraveling. The house was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I tried to ignore it, as I always do when a strange feeling starts creeping into the back of my mind. I remember the moment it happened, though. It was nothing dramatic at first. No loud crash, no flickering lights, just a subtle shift. I had been walking through the hall, heading towards the bathroom, when I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My reflection, no, it didn't look quite right. It wasn't the same, not in the way you might think. It was as though the image was shifting. A small, almost imperceptible ripple in the air, like a mirage. At first, I brushed it off. It was probably just my eyes playing tricks on me, right? I had been working a lot lately, sleep deprived. Maybe that's all it was. But the more I stared at it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The reflection didn't stay still like it should have. It moved with a kind of hesitation, like it was unsure of its own existence. I turned away, trying to ignore the unease bubbling inside me. "It's nothing," I muttered under my breath. But when I entered the bathroom, it wasn't the same. The dim light cast a strange shadow across the room. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I glanced at the mirror again, half expecting the reflection to act up once more. And this time, it did. The reflection wasn't whole. The edges of my silhouette seemed to blur into nothingness. It was as if the darkness in the room was slowly swallowing me up, erasing parts of me from existence. It was impossible. Shadows couldn't do that. Could they? I stepped closer, my heart pounding. My own image wavered. I felt cold all of a sudden, a chill creeping down my spine. This wasn't a trick of the light, or my tired mind. No, something was happening. Something was wrong with me, with the very core of who I was. I reached out toward the mirror. My reflection didn't move in sync. It stayed still, but my hand trembled in midair. The more I focused on it, the more the feeling of something slipping away intensified. It wasn't just a reflection. It was me. I was fading. That was the moment I realized it. The shadows were stealing parts of me. My own reflection, my essence, was being drained piece by piece, and I had no control over it. But who would believe me? Would I even be able to explain it? I looked around the bathroom, the cold tiles, the faint drip of water from the faucet. It was all too normal, too unremarkable. Yet the longer I stayed in that room, the more it felt like everything was slipping into something unrecognizable. I didn't know what to do. The shadows had started to feel alive, as if they were feeding off me, growing stronger the longer I stood there. I tried to step back, but my reflection lingered in my peripheral vision, and it was no longer just a reflection. It was an entity, an existence that stretched and pulled, devouring all light around it. I couldn't breathe. There was something I had to do. Something I didn't understand yet. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever this was, it wasn't just in the mirror. The darkness wasn't confined to the glass. It was creeping into the corners of my mind, pulling at the edges of my soul. And as I looked at myself once more, I realized something terrifying. My reflection had stopped moving altogether. It was now me that was the shadow. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat as I stood frozen in front of the bathroom mirror, unable to tear my eyes away from the reflection, or rather, the lack of it. It wasn't just fading now. It was gone. The edges of my figure dissolved into the dark shadows, like they had never existed. I reached out again, my fingers trembling. This time, my hand passed straight through the reflection, the cool surface of the mirror offering no resistance. I gasped and yanked my hand back. It wasn't real, and yet it felt so real. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet, the chill in the air now turning into an unbearable cold that clung to my skin. I couldn't breathe properly. The walls seemed to close in, as if they were watching me too. The once safe bathroom had turned into a claustrophobic prison, and I couldn't escape the rising panic. I couldn't look away from the mirror. No matter how hard I tried, my eyes were locked onto the empty space. My own face wasn't there. It was as if I had vanished. The reflection was gone, yes, but there was something else, something darker that was creeping through the edges of the glass, pulling at me, drawing me in. I backed away, stumbling out of the bathroom, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The hallway felt infinitely longer than usual, the walls stretching and narrowing as if they were alive. My footsteps echoed eerily in the silence of the house, a silence that felt heavy, oppressive. I ran to the living room, desperate for some kind of familiar comfort, but even there, nothing felt right. The space was too large, the corners too dark, as if the shadows were growing, taking shape in the places they shouldn't be. I looked at the lamps, dim, as though the light itself was being sucked away. The longer I stayed in the room, the more I felt them, watching me. And that's when it hit me. The shadows weren't just in the mirror. They were here. They were all around me, shifting, moving. They were trying to take something. Something essential. Me. I ran to the window, throwing open the blinds to let the outside light in, but even the moon seemed dimmer than usual, like it was struggling to hold its place in the sky. I squinted, feeling the darkness creeping into the room from every direction. It had already started to consume me. I could feel it, deep in my chest. The part of me that should have been whole was slipping away. I turned back to look at the hallway. It was wrong. The shadows were longer now, stretching unnaturally across the walls. I could feel them pulling, tugging at my very essence. I needed to find a way out, but the door, the windows, they were all just barriers now. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but the feeling of being haunted was unmistakable. It was like a presence, something that had been with me all along, watching, waiting, feeding on my fear. I tried to shake the thought away, but it stuck. The longer I stood there, the more I felt as though something was tugging at the very fabric of my being, threatening to pull me apart. Then came the sound. At first, it was a soft rustling, like paper being crumpled in the distance. But as I listened, it grew louder, more distinct. A scratching, clawing sound. The noise echoed in the silence, an unnatural, grating sound that sent a wave of dread through me. I turned to face the source, but all I could see were the shadows, pressing closer, creeping along the floor, the walls, the ceiling. I backed away, heart racing, as the scratching sound grew louder, more urgent. Something was moving in the dark, something alive. And then, I saw it. The shape. It was faint at first, just a blur at the edge of my vision, but as it inched closer, it became clearer. A figure. A shadow, but not just any shadow. It was shifting, moving in a way that didn't make sense. It was like it was alive, but not in the way a person is. It wasn't human. I froze, unable to move, my eyes locked on it. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs stretching far beyond what should have been possible. But there was something wrong with it. The edges of the shadows seemed to melt into the surrounding darkness, flickering in and out of existence. I couldn't breathe. The cold was suffocating, crawling under my skin, seeping into my bones. The figure moved again, slowly, almost like it was testing the air, as though it could sense my fear. And it was getting closer. Was this the thing that had been stealing my reflection? My essence? I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I could feel the pull, the draw of the shadows wrapping around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, taking shape and form right before my eyes. The figure's movement was jerky now, disjointed, but I could hear it, its breath, shallow, ragged. It was getting closer, and I couldn't escape. "Who are you?" I gasped, the words slipping out of my mouth before I could stop them. But the figure didn't answer. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence, its mere existence, was all the answer I needed. And then, the lights flickered. Just once. And the figure was gone. But the shadows, they were still here. I couldn't bring myself to move. My body felt like it was glued to the floor, as though the weight of the shadows had rooted me in place. The air around me was thick, suffocating. I could still feel it, them pressing in, like 1,000 eyes were watching from the corners of the room. And the silence, it was oppressive, like it was waiting for something to happen. I glanced around, but there was nothing. The figure had vanished. The darkness seemed to shift in its place, but nothing was physically there. It was as though it had never been. I tried to take a step, but my legs felt weak, like they couldn't carry me. My heart was hammering in my chest. The quiet was maddening. I needed to do something. I needed to get out of this house. I moved to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. The house creaked under my touch, as though it was alive, reacting to my every movement. I pulled the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. I stepped out into the hallway, but the moment I did, the air felt wrong. The space was distorted, like a funhouse mirror, warped and alien. The hallway stretched out unnaturally, far longer than it should have been. I blinked, and the walls seemed to shift, the shadows dancing in ways that weren't possible. They reached out, curled up at the edges of the walls like fingers, pulling and tugging at the very fabric of the space. The lights above flickered, casting irregular shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. It wasn't just the shadows anymore, it was everything. The house itself felt like it was breathing, like it was alive and aware of me. The floorboards creaked underfoot, a noise that sounded too loud in the stifling silence. I turned back to the room, half expecting to see that figure again. But it was gone. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching from the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. waiting for me to slip up. I backed into the living room, hands trembling as I scanned the space. The furniture was unchanged, but it all felt foreign, as though it no longer belonged here. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, almost mocking me, each second stretching longer than the last. The shadows seemed to thicken again, their shapes becoming more distinct. They were moving now, sliding along the walls, flickering at the edges of my vision. But it was worse this time. They weren't just shapes anymore, they were becoming more solid. I could almost see the outline of something within them, something alive. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But I knew deep down that it was. The more I thought about it, the clearer the images became. Those shadows weren't just shadows. They were trying to take something from me. They were trying to pull me into their world, into the dark, where nothing could escape. A sound broke through the tension. A soft scratching, far too faint to be real, but too clear to ignore. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. I took a step back, but my foot collided with something. I looked down, and the sight sent a shock of panic through me. It was a photograph. My photograph. The one I had taken only a few weeks ago. But this time, it was different. The image was distorted, warped. The faces in it, my face, my family's face, were melting into the background, their features blurring and stretching in unnatural ways. The picture was changing before my eyes, as if it were alive, evolving. I dropped the photo, my heart racing in my chest. The scratching sound grew louder now, closer. I spun around, searching the room in desperation. Then, I saw it. There, in the far corner, something shifted. A figure, barely visible, but unmistakable. It was crouching low, its back hunched in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't like the figure from before, this was different. It was smaller, but somehow more menacing. Its arms were long and thin, stretching unnaturally across the floor. Its head was tilted to the side, and for a moment, I thought it was staring directly at me. I froze, my body locked in place. My throat was tight, and I couldn't make a sound. The figure began to move, crawling toward me with a horrible, jerking motion. Its limbs twisted, bones cracking as it advanced. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the creature. It was growing stronger, moving faster with each passing second. And with every step it took, the shadows grew darker, more oppressive, until the room itself felt like it was closing in. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the floor, my legs barely able to carry me as I darted toward the door. But it felt like the hallway was stretching further away, the distance growing longer with every step I took. I reached for the door, but my hand was shaking so violently I couldn't grip the knob. And then the air changed. The temperature dropped. The shadows surged, flooding the room. The figure was behind me now, so close I could feel its breath on my neck. I turned just in time to see its face. It wasn't human. Its features were elongated, its skin pale and stretched tight over a skull that seemed too big for its body. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me. They were black, empty, and they stared right into my soul, like they could see everything about me. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The darkness was swallowing me whole. And then everything went black. I woke up gasping for air, my lungs burning as though I had been drowning. I shot up from the floor, my heart pounding in my chest, my body slick with sweat. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been. For a moment, I thought I was still trapped in that suffocating darkness. But as my vision adjusted, I realized I was in the living room again. The same place I had been before, except it didn't feel the same. Nothing felt the same anymore. The walls were now strangely warped, as though the house itself was bending and breathing. The furniture looked out of place, misaligned, as if it had been shoved aside by an invisible hand. The floor creaked beneath me, more loudly than it had ever done before. The ticking of the clock sounded distorted, far too sharp for my ears. And the air was heavy, saturated with an unnatural stillness. I stood up, unsteady, my hands shaking. I didn't know what was real anymore, and the more I tried to grasp at some sense of reality, the further it slipped away. The shadows, their presence, was palpable now. They weren't just stretching along the walls, they were crawling over the furniture, seeping into every crack and crevice, filling the room with something alive. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through my chest. It was faint at first, like a distant whisper, but it grew louder with every passing second. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. It echoed in my skull, like it was inside my mind. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it wouldn't stop. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling, and that sound was the stitch that held it all together. I stumbled forward, my legs uncooperative, barely able to support me. I needed to get out of this place. I needed to escape. The front door was within reach. It wasn't far. But the moment I moved toward it, a figure appeared in the corner of my eye. My heart skipped a beat, and my body froze in terror. There was no mistaking it. The creature was there again. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. It crouched in the corner, watching me. Its limbs were twisted and unnaturally long, its fingers stretching out, almost grazing the floor. The face, it was there, too. That twisted, contorted face. Those eyes. They were black, empty, hollow pits that seemed to suck in the light, leaving nothing behind. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs were glued to the floor. The creature didn't move, it just watched. And I felt it more than I saw it. It was like a presence, a weight on my chest, suffocating me, drowning me in its gaze. It knows me. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing, it knew me. It knew something about me, something I couldn't understand, but I could feel it deep in my bones. And then, without warning, the room shifted again. The walls warped, bending inward, closing in on me. The floor beneath my feet became soft, like sinking into a thick, damp fog. The shadows stretched, distorting the space until the room felt smaller. I was trapped. Panic surged through me, a wave of raw terror that broke through the paralysis. I didn't care how, I didn't care why, I just needed to get out. I turned and ran, my heart racing, each step feeling like an eternity. The door was right there. I could almost feel the cool air on the other side, the freedom that I so desperately needed. But as my hand reached for the doorknob, the shadows surged forward, moving as if they had a mind of their own. They wrapped around my wrist, pulling me back. The darkness thickened, seeping through the cracks in the walls, filling every corner of the room. My body screamed in resistance, but it was no use. I could feel it, that presence, drawing closer. The creature's eyes were on me again. It was closer now. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, jerking as it crawled toward me. Its face twisted into a grotesque smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was hungry. I fought against the shadows, tearing at my wrist, but the more I struggled, the tighter they gripped. It was as if they were trying to pull me into the very fabric of the house itself, to drown me in the dark. I could barely breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. My vision blurred. And then, as if something inside me snapped, I let out a scream. It was a desperate, animal sound, a cry for escape. My voice was raw, hoarse, but it was enough. The shadows faltered, retreating for just a moment. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I wrenched the door open and bolted into the hallway, gasping for air. But even as I ran, the house seemed to twist around me, its walls shifting and groaning like it was alive, bending and contorting, trying to trap me inside. I could hear the creature behind me. Its footsteps, if you could call them that, scraped against the floor, long, dragging steps that echoed through the space. The air grew colder with every second, and I felt the darkness closing in, chasing me, pulling me further into the house. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I had to survive. The hallway stretched ahead, but I could see a door at the end of it. A way out. I pushed forward, each step a battle, each breath harder to take. But when I reached the door, I realized something was wrong. The door, it was locked. I pounded on it, desperation flooding my veins. I turned the handle again and again, but it wouldn't budge. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, barely audible, but then louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from the creature. It was coming from inside the door. A voice, low and raspy, whispering my name. You can't leave. The voice, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a presence, like a cold hand against the back of my neck. It wrapped itself around me, pulling me closer to the door, binding me in place. I could feel the weight of it, pressing down on my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. You're not going anywhere, the voice rasped, its tone unmistakably familiar, but twisted. It sounded like me, or rather, like the version of me that I was afraid to confront. I took a step back, my hand still clutched tightly around the doorknob, but it felt wrong. The door wasn't just locked anymore, it was alive, pulsing beneath my touch. The wood felt soft, like skin, warm and wet, like it was breathing. I didn't know how to describe it, but I felt it, something behind the door was waiting. And that thing, it wasn't just waiting for me to leave. It was waiting for me to enter. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, every step of the house pressing against my skin like it was trying to consume me. The air smelled stale now, thick with rot, and the shadows were growing, stretching further into the hallway, clawing their way toward me, hungry, eager. A loud creak echoed in the silence as I looked back toward the direction I had come from. The hallway was longer now, far longer than I remembered. It was as if the house was expanding, breathing, changing shape. The walls were closing in on me, inch by inch, like a living, pulsing thing. The shadows moved with purpose, now swirling in the corners, not just creeping along the walls, but actively shifting, as if they were forming something monstrous. I slammed my palm against the door again, my breath ragged, panic rising in my throat. The voice inside was taunting me now. You can't escape this time. I turned back to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The handle, it was still locked. But the whispering voice knew. It knew what I had been thinking. It knew the fear that was building inside me, knew how close I was to breaking. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I couldn't let it win. I yanked on the door with all my strength, but the wood groaned in protest, resisting. For a moment, the air seemed to freeze, holding its breath as I struggled. And then, with a sharp, ear-splitting crack, the door jerked open just enough to reveal what was waiting on the other side. It was dark, too dark. The darkness wasn't just absence, it was thick, like a viscous liquid that slithered and pooled in the corners of the frame. I could feel it pressing against my skin, tugging at me, beckoning me to step into it. I didn't want to look, didn't want to know what lay beyond that suffocating blackness. But I couldn't stop myself. I stepped forward, my body moving against my will. And that's when I saw it. A figure, no, a shape, moved in the darkness. It was tall, its form angular and twisted, shifting like smoke, its edges never quite solid. It was like it was part of the darkness, as if it had been born from it. And then I heard it. A low, rasping breath that came from somewhere deep within the thing. "Welcome home," it said. I stumbled back, my heart racing, blood pounding in my ears. The world seemed to bend, to shift, to collapse inward as I tried to process what I was seeing. But what I was seeing, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the voice, my voice, kept echoing in my mind. It was me. It was something I had lost, something I had forgotten. It was me, or it had been. The figure moved again, its long, stretched limbs twisting in ways that were not possible for a human body. It came closer, its form solidifying, though its features remained blurry, indistinct, like a half-formed memory, a dream you can't quite remember. It stopped just a few feet from me. "I am you," it whispered. Its voice was so close, I could feel it vibrating in my chest. "All that you've lost. All that you've forgotten." My head was spinning. My thoughts were muddled, jumbled. This was impossible. I was staring at myself, yet not myself. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't even a shadow. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. "You've been running from it," it continued, stepping closer, its feet dragging across the floor, sending a chill up my spine. "But you can't escape what's inside of you. What you've become." The words struck me like a physical blow. I took a step back, my hand scrambling for the door, but it was too late. The figure reached out with its long, twisted hand, fingers outstretched. And in that instant, I felt it, the cold, sharp presence of it wrapping around my wrist, pulling me forward, forcing me into the darkness. "No!" I screamed, but it was already too late. The world around me vanished. The walls of the hallway, the door, the creature, it all disappeared into the dark. And then, nothing. I woke up again, but this time it was different. I was in the same place, the same house. But it was wrong. Everything was wrong. I was standing in front of the mirror again, my own reflection staring back at me. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was empty. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Not just in the way that you might catch someone glancing at you, but that constant, creeping sensation that someone or something was always there, lingering just outside your vision? I thought I knew what that feeling was, but I had no idea. My apartment was supposed to be a safe space. A quiet, solitary place where I could shut out the world, where nothing would happen. I'd lived here for months without issue, content to go about my days, lost in the small routines that made up my life. But then it started, those damn shadows. It wasn't something I noticed immediately. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or perhaps a trick of the light. I'd come home late one night, tired from a long shift at the office, and there they were. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement on the wall, an imperceptible shift in shape. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the lighting, or maybe a bug crawling along the wall. But when I turned on the lamp, they didn't go away. The shadows didn't move like normal shadows. They didn't stretch or shrink according to the light source. No. These things seemed to move independently, as if they had a life of their own. They danced on the walls, twisting and turning in ways that felt wrong. They would appear in one spot and then vanish, only to resurface somewhere else. The movements were subtle at first, but over time, they became more pronounced. I tried to rationalize it, of course. Shadows can be deceptive, right? The angle of the light can play tricks on your eyes. Maybe it was just the old furniture casting strange shapes. But no matter how much I tried to explain it away, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. The feeling that something was there, watching me. And it wasn't just the shadows. I started hearing things. Quiet noises, soft scraping sounds coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, the creaks and groans that come with age. But there were moments when the sounds felt deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I tried to tell myself that I was being paranoid, that I was just stressed from work, but it didn't help. The noise didn't stop. I would sit in the living room, staring at the walls, waiting for the next movement, the next flicker. The longer I stayed in that apartment, the worse it got. The shadows moved faster. The sounds grew louder. I could feel them, now. I could feel them watching me. It wasn't just my eyes playing tricks on me. It was something deeper, something I couldn't explain, something that didn't belong. The shadows weren't normal. And the longer I stayed, the more certain I became that whatever they weren't just shadows. There was something in the air. A heaviness that hung in the room, pressing against my chest. Every time I turned my back, I felt a presence, something waiting for me. But whenever I tried to look directly at it, it would disappear. Vanish into the corner of my vision, just beyond the reach of my understanding. I kept telling myself that it was nothing. That I was just tired, or imagining things. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared in a way that was difficult to explain, even to myself. I began to dread the quiet. The silence became oppressive, like a weight pressing down on me. The shadows moved closer, and the sounds grew louder, more insistent. And then, one night, it happened. I was sitting in the kitchen, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, when I heard it again, the unmistakable scraping noise, coming from the living room. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, like something was dragging itself along the wall. I stood up, heart racing, and walked toward the sound. The room was empty, as expected. But the shadows, those goddamn shadows, were there, moving again. They were larger this time, more pronounced, and they didn't just move on the walls anymore. They seemed to stretch toward the ceiling, toward the floor, becoming twisted shapes that didn't make any sense. I took a step back, my hand trembling as it reached for the light switch. But before I could flick it on, the shadows moved fast, too fast. They stretched across the room in an instant, covering the walls and ceiling in a way that felt unnatural. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath puffing in the cold air. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. What was happening? What were those things? I told myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light, or maybe some weird optical illusion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew something was wrong. Something was inside the apartment with me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to. Suddenly, the scraping sound returned, louder than ever. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my eyes wide, but there was nothing there. Except the shadows. They were moving faster now, quicker than I could follow. And for the first time, I realized they weren't just on the walls. They were in the room with me, creeping toward me, curling and twisting like living things. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there, to leave it all behind. But the door was blocked. I turned to it, but no matter how hard I pulled, the door wouldn't open. It felt as if something was holding it shut, pressing against the wood from the other side. I was trapped. The shadows were closing in. Their shapes became clearer now, figures, vaguely humanoid, but twisted and distorted. I couldn't see their faces. They didn't have faces. They didn't need them. Their presence was enough. I backed away slowly, the cold air around me thickening, and then the walls began to bend, warping like rubber. It felt like the apartment itself was coming alive, shifting around me, drawing me in. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the sound of whispers. Soft, indistinct, but full of malice. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they weren't meant for me. They were meant for someone else. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been minutes, hours, or even days. Time felt like it had stopped entirely when I finally woke up. My head throbbed, my mouth was dry, and everything felt wrong. It was as if I had been transported to a different reality, a place where the laws of physics didn't apply, where the very air seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying on the living room floor. The same room where the shadows had been, the same room that had just tried to consume me. I didn't know how I had gotten there, or why I hadn't been torn apart by whatever had been lurking in the darkness. The room was eerily quiet now, too quiet. I could feel the silence pressing in on me, suffocating me. The shadows had retreated, but they hadn't disappeared. I slowly sat up, my body stiff and aching. I could still feel the cold air on my skin, a cold that wasn't natural, a cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The apartment looked exactly as it had before, yet everything felt different. The space was warped somehow. The corners seemed too sharp, the angles too harsh. It was as though the very layout of the room had shifted while I was unconscious. I looked around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows were gone, but I knew they were still there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. I stood up unsteadily, my legs weak beneath me. I needed to get out of this place. I needed to leave before whatever was haunting me came back. But when I reached for the door, I froze. The door. It was wide open. I could have sworn I had locked it before. I always locked it. The sound of the latch clicking into place was something I never forgot. But now, the door stood ajar, as if someone, or something, had opened it. A cold gust of wind blew in from outside, carrying with it the scent of something musty, like old leaves or damp earth. The air in the apartment grew thicker, heavier, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The shadows were still here. I could sense them, just beyond my reach, pulling at the edges of my vision. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what might be waiting out there in the hallway, in the dark, but my feet moved against my will, dragging me toward the door. I stood at the threshold for a moment, hesitating. My heart hammered in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to stay inside the apartment where it was safe. But the door was open, and something was calling me. A low, muffled whisper coming from beyond the hallway. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, like the murmur of distant voices, soft but insistent. It sounded like they were saying my name. David. I jumped at the sound of my name, but there was no one there. Just shadows. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts, trying to remind myself that this was all in my head. That there was some rational explanation for the way the air felt thick and oppressive, for the way the shadows refused to stay still. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. There was something here, something beyond the ordinary, something that didn't belong. I took a step forward, my fingers brushing the doorframe as I passed through. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and silent. The lights flickered above me, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat. The longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of the apartment pressing in on me, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I forced myself to take another step. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the presence of something watching me from the shadows. I turned toward the kitchen, my eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The room was empty, but the air felt wrong. Too thick. Too still. There was something here. I stepped closer to the counter, where a knife had been left out earlier. I didn't remember leaving it there, but I hadn't been paying attention. The knife was gleaming, almost too brightly, as if it were waiting for me to pick it up. Suddenly, the scraping noise returned. Faint at first, just a whisper against the walls, but it was growing louder. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was moving, something was dragging itself along the walls. It was coming from the living room. I turned toward the sound, my heart in my throat, and that's when I saw it. The shadows weren't just moving now. They had taken shape, twisted, distorted forms that shifted and undulated like liquid, like something alive. I could see the vague outlines of figures, but they weren't human. Not entirely. The shapes were wrong, too long, too angular, like they didn't belong to this world. I took a step back, my legs shaking. The shadows stretched toward me, growing larger with each passing second, but they didn't move like normal shadows. No, these were alive. I could feel them. They were reaching out for me. I stumbled back into the kitchen, knocking a glass off the counter. It shattered on the floor, but the sound barely registered. I was too focused on the shadows, too focused on the way they were moving toward me, wrapping around the furniture, creeping up the walls. I needed to leave. I needed to get out, but the door was still open. And it wasn't enough. I was trapped. I couldn't breathe. The air had turned suffocating, thick with an unnatural cold. Every time I tried to move, my legs felt heavier, as if the shadows were pulling me back, forcing me to stay in the dark space they had claimed. My heart was pounding, each beat louder than the last, until it drowned out every other sound. I backed up toward the kitchen counter, my fingers grazing the cool metal of the knife I had abandoned earlier. It was still there, waiting, gleaming. The shadows hadn't reached it yet, but I didn't know if that would be enough. What could a knife do against something like this? Against something that didn't even seem real? The shapes in the living room were changing now, shifting faster. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were like ink spilling across the walls, forming grotesque, twisting silhouettes. The air grew heavier, thicker with each movement. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, their surfaces pulsating, rippling, as though the entire apartment were alive. I tried to steady myself, but my body was betraying me. Every inch of my skin prickled with the overwhelming sense that I was being watched, not by a single pair of eyes, but by countless unseen eyes, all focused on me. The faint whispers began again, only this time they were clearer, more urgent. David. I shook my head, telling myself that I was losing my mind, that there had to be a logical explanation for all of this. But logic wasn't helping me now. The shadows were growing stronger, moving in closer. Their unnatural movements were like liquid smoke, creeping across the room in strange patterns. And with each step they took, I felt an undeniable pull, as if I was being dragged toward them. I felt the walls around me bend, warping with each passing second. The room was no longer a place I recognized. The familiar creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, everything was gone. In its place, there was only an eerie stillness, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, one of the shadow figures lunged forward, its shape snapping into something much clearer. A tall, thin figure, almost too thin, its limbs contorted at impossible angles. I could see its face now, but it wasn't a face at all. It was a void, a hole where a face should have been, blacker than the shadows themselves, an emptiness that seemed to devour all light around it. My breath hitched in my throat. I could hear its movements now, slow and deliberate, as though it was savoring the moment. It reached out with a long, bony hand, the fingers elongated and twitching. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen, as if the fear had become a part of me. The thing took another step closer. My legs gave way beneath me, and I fell to the floor, the cold tiles pressing against my palms. I scrambled backward, my hands shaking as I tried to push myself away from the approaching figure. But no matter how far I moved, it was always just there, an inch away, its presence suffocating. A voice, my voice, barely a whisper, fought to break free from my throat. "What do you want?" It was a pathetic plea. The figure paused. For a moment, I thought it would speak. I thought maybe it would answer, reveal itself fully, explain why it was here. But it didn't. Instead, it simply tilted its head, the empty space where its face should have been staring straight at me. Its body jerked in a twisted motion, its fingers curling toward me as if they were pulling at the very fabric of the air around us. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. Anything. I reached out, grabbing the knife from the counter with trembling hands. The cold steel was a small comfort, but it felt inadequate in my grip. How could I defend myself against something like this? Against something that didn't even make sense? The shadow loomed over me, its dark form stretching across the floor, blocking my escape. I forced myself to stand, my legs wobbling beneath me, my pulse ringing in my ears. The shadow figure moved again, its pace picking up, its form flickering with an unsettling speed. I took a step back, my hands gripping the knife tighter, but my mind screamed that it was futile. I was a fool for even thinking I could fight this. But then, as if responding to my fear, the shadows began to shift again. They were pulling back, retreating into the corners of the room, folding into themselves like a retreating tide. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, and I stood there, frozen, unsure of what was happening. I glanced around the room, every instinct telling me to get out, but the open door, was now shut. I hadn't heard it close. I hadn't even seen it move, but it was no longer a way out. The sound of the latch clicking echoed in the silence like a death knell. I turned to the window next, but the same sense of hopelessness gripped me. Outside, the streetlights flickered, casting long, strange shadows on the pavement as though they too were being consumed by something. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in even tighter, closing around me like a trap. The figures, shadows, remained, but they were no longer advancing. They were waiting. I felt the pull again, like invisible strings were attached to me, tugging me closer toward them. The darkness at the edges of the room seemed to thicken, filling the space with an oppressive weight, choking the air around me. And that's when I heard it. A sound. A faint rustle, as though someone was moving just out of my line of sight. I turned sharply, eyes darting to every corner, searching for the source. And there it was, at the edge of the hallway. A figure. This one wasn't a shadow. This one was human. Or at least, it looked human. A woman. Her hair was long, disheveled, falling over her face like a curtain. She stood there motionless, her back to me, her body unnaturally still. But there was something about her that made my stomach twist in terror. The whispers started again, louder this time. More urgent. And the woman's head turned slowly toward me. David. Her voice was soft, but it wasn't her voice. It was wrong. Something about it was off, hollow, distant. And then I saw it. Her eyes were hollow too. Empty. Black. Her hand, skeletal and trembling, reached out toward me. Come closer. I wanted to scream. To run. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away. The room seemed to grow colder still, the temperature plummeting, biting at my skin. My breath formed visible clouds in front of me, and the hairs on my arms stood up, each one twitching as though trying to escape the chill in the air. But it wasn't just the cold that froze me to the spot. It was her, the woman in front of me, her eyes hollow and black, her hand stretched toward me like a dark invitation. Come closer, she whispered again, her voice jagged and hollow, like something scraping against the inside of my skull. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body felt like stone. Every part of me screamed to move, to run, but I couldn't. My feet were nailed to the floor, my legs trembling beneath me as I watched her slowly take a step forward. The shadows behind her twisted, bending and swirling around her as if they were an extension of her being. They writhed and coiled, like living creatures trying to drag me into their depths. I could feel them. I could feel their hunger. And I knew, deep down, that if I took a single step toward her, I would be lost forever. I blinked, trying to shake off the hold she had on me. But when I opened my eyes again, she was closer. Just a few feet away now, her blackened eyes never leaving mine. She wasn't walking. She was floating, gliding silently across the floor, her movements smooth and unnatural, as though she was being pulled by something unseen. I couldn't stop myself from backing away, my hands trembling, the knife still clutched tightly in my grip. The cold steel felt so small in my hands now, useless. The closer she came, the heavier the air became, until it felt as though I was suffocating in it. Her smile, or what I assumed was a smile, was wide, too wide. Her lips stretched unnaturally, revealing jagged, blackened teeth, but it wasn't the teeth that terrified me the most. It was the look in her eyes, the sheer emptiness. It was like looking into a void, and I knew that if I stared too long, I would fall into it, never to return. David, she said again, her voice echoing in my mind. I've been waiting for you. Her words weren't comforting. They weren't an invitation either. They were a threat. My pulse raced, and I felt the air around me shift. The room seemed to grow darker, the edges of the walls dissolving into a thick, oppressive blackness that I couldn't escape. I could still see her, but it was like she was no longer entirely in the same dimension as me. She was both here and not here, hovering between the space where reality no longer made sense. I forced myself to turn away from her. I had to find a way out. I had to leave. But the door, the one I thought was shut, was now wide open. I didn't hesitate. I ran. My feet pounded against the cold floor as I rushed toward the exit, the shadows trailing behind me, moving as fast as I was, their shapes slithering like serpents in my peripheral vision. The hallway stretched out before me, the darkness at its end closing in on me with every step. I could feel her presence just behind me, closing the distance. Her voice echoed in my ears. You can't run, David. You can't escape. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. But even without looking, I knew she was there, right behind me, her breath hot on my neck, her presence suffocating. I could hear her footfalls, slow and deliberate, matching my pace. I reached the staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight, but the darkness kept pushing forward. The walls seemed to close in around me, as though the very space itself was conspiring to trap me in this nightmare. The shadows were everywhere now, curling around the banister, creeping across the floor, their long, spindly fingers grazing against my legs, pulling at my clothes, trying to drag me down. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the front door just a few feet away. I was so close. I could taste the air outside, the freedom. But as my hand reached for the doorknob, I heard her voice again. You're not going anywhere, David. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows, and I stumbled back, the impact sending me sprawling onto the floor. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat like a hammer striking against my ribs. The shadows, thick and suffocating, closed in on me from all sides. I scrambled to my feet, but the room had changed again. The walls had begun to stretch and warp, bending in unnatural ways. The shadows themselves seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if the very air had become a living, breathing thing, and it was slowly tightening around me like a noose. I had nowhere to go. I turned to face the stairs again, but they were gone. The hallway had disappeared, replaced by an endless, yawning blackness that seemed to stretch forever. I was trapped. Then, something shifted behind me. A cold breath against my ear. A whisper so close it almost made my skin crawl. David. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the thick, swirling darkness. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to take a deep breath. Think. There had to be a way out. There had to be something I could do. But when I opened my eyes, the figure was there again. The woman. And this time, she wasn't floating. She was standing right in front of me, her mouth twisted into that horrifying smile. Why do you fight, David? She asked, her voice a soft, mocking sing-song. It's already too late. The knife. I had to use it. With a sudden, desperate movement, I lunged at her, the blade flashing in the dim light. But just as I reached her, the shadows seemed to swallow her whole. She vanished into the dark, leaving only the faintest trace of her presence, a whisper, a cold chill, the smell of something rotten. I stood there, breathing heavily, knife still raised, but she was gone. For now. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. I didn't know how long I could stay in this place before it consumed me completely. But I knew one thing for sure. She was still watching. And soon, I would have nowhere left to hide. The room was quiet now, too quiet. The oppressive darkness that had once filled the space seemed to have receded, but its lingering presence still hung thick in the air, like smoke that refuses to dissipate. I stood motionless, the blade still clenched in my hand, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My pulse throbbed in my temples, each beat louder than the last. Had she really gone? I didn't know anymore. Reality had become a blur, twisted and fragmented like a shattered mirror. My mind couldn't hold on to anything for long. The world around me felt so thin, like it could shatter with the slightest touch. The silence stretched on, unbearable and suffocating. The weight of it pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, anything. A creak. A whisper. A footstep. But nothing. I didn't know how long I stood there, but the tension in my body began to ease, if only for a moment. I thought I had won. I thought she had left me. Then the floorboards creaked. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like someone shifting their weight just out of sight. I froze, not daring to move. The floor creaked again, louder this time, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. They were slow, methodical, like the pacing of a predator who knows its prey is just around the corner. I spun around, the knife held tight in my hand, ready to strike. But there was nothing. Nothing but the dark corners of the room, empty and still. The silence returned. Only this time, it felt worse, unnerving. Like the calm before a storm. I took a tentative step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. Each footfall felt too loud, as if the entire room could hear me. I held my breath, praying that I wasn't about to make the worst mistake of my life. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from above. The sound was so violent, so out of place, that I jumped, my pulse spiking once more. It was followed by another thump, and then a third. The sounds were coming from the ceiling. I looked up, my eyes scanning the cracks in the old wooden beams. The house, which had always felt so solid before, now seemed fragile, like it could collapse at any moment under the weight of whatever was lurking above. Another thump, followed by a scraping sound, as though something sharp was being dragged across the floorboards. My hands were trembling, but I moved toward the stairs anyway. The shadows clung to the walls, their unnatural shapes stretching toward me, but I couldn't stop. I had to know what was happening. I had to see for myself. With each step, the darkness around me deepened, swallowing the faint light from the hallway. I could feel the temperature drop again, a chill crawling up my spine, freezing my very bones. The house had never been this cold, not even in the dead of winter. I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretching out before me like a narrow tunnel into oblivion. The sounds from above had stopped, but I could feel the weight of the silence, like something was waiting just beyond my sight. I forced myself to move forward, my hand on the railing as I crept along the corridor. The shadows were everywhere now, twisting and shifting, like they were alive, waiting to pounce. I stopped in front of the door to the attic. The wooden door was slightly ajar, just enough to let a sliver of dark light spill into the hallway. The air around the door felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut, that primal instinct telling me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a small window at the far end where the moonlight struggled to break through the grime-streaked glass. And then I saw it. At the center of the room, sitting on the dusty wooden floor, was a pile of old boxes, clothes, furniture, books, and trinkets that seemed as if they had been abandoned long ago. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the figure in the corner. A shadow. No, not just a shadow. A person, no, something that looked like a person, crouched in the farthest corner of the attic. Her back was to me, and her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like she was waiting for me to come closer. The shadows seemed to move with her, like they were part of her body, twisting and coiling around her like a shroud. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in matted clumps around her face. But it was her hands that terrified me the most. They were outstretched, fingers twitching and clawing at the air, as though they were reaching for something or someone. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my throat. "David," the voice whispered, soft and cold, like the wind through cracked glass. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The figure's head turned, and I saw her face. It wasn't her face anymore. It was a twisted, grotesque mask, empty eyes, a mouth stretched wide into an unnatural grin. It was like looking into a void, a dark hole where no light could ever escape. I felt my knees buckle, and I collapsed onto the floor, my mind spinning with panic. But just as quickly as she appeared, the figure vanished. The shadows retreated, and the room was empty once again. I didn't know if I had imagined it, if it was all a product of my fear and exhaustion, but it didn't matter. I was no longer alone. The feeling of being watched, the suffocating pressure of unseen eyes, was back. And it was stronger than ever. I wasn't going to survive this. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running from the shadows. Have you ever wondered who might be watching you, even when you're alone? And how could they know things about you that no one else could possibly know? I ask myself that question every time I open a letter that doesn't have a return address. It started innocently enough, one morning when I found a folded envelope lying on my doorstep. There was nothing unusual about the envelope at first glance. The paper was plain, the handwriting on the front was neat, but the ink was smudged, like it had been rushed. I almost threw it away, thinking it was just another piece of junk mail. But something stopped me. I opened it, and that's when everything changed. The letter inside was unlike any I had ever received. There were no greetings, no explanation, just a detailed description of my life, my daily routines, my habits, even things I thought I had kept hidden from everyone. My heart raced as I read through the lines, each word more unsettling than the last. How could anyone know these things? My favorite coffee shop, the route I took to work every day, the way I always double-checked the locks before bed. It was as if this person had been watching me, had been there all along. At first, I thought it was a joke. A prank, maybe, or some kind of sick game. But then the letter made a strange, chilling remark. "You never noticed, but I was with you last Thursday evening. I saw the way you looked out the window, staring into the darkness, wondering if anyone could see you. I was there." My hand shook as I read the words. The letter was postmarked from a nearby town, but the details were too specific to be coincidence. I had been alone that Thursday, sitting by my window, staring into the streetlight as the shadows of night seemed to stretch further than usual. And now someone knew. Someone had seen me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a mistake, a misunderstanding. But that thought didn't bring me comfort. The more I thought about it, the more the letter gnawed at me. What if I wasn't just imagining things? What if someone truly was watching me? I spent the next few days and days constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that someone was lurking in the corners of my vision. I checked the locks twice as often, and when I went out, I couldn't help but feel like someone was following me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the truth was, nothing felt the same anymore. Then, another letter arrived. It was the same. No return address. The handwriting was different, but the words, the details, they were all the same. This time, it was even worse. It spoke of things I had never told a soul, my deepest secrets, the ones I never dared to speak aloud. It described the quiet shame I carried with me, the small, hidden parts of myself that I tried so desperately to bury. It knew things I had forgotten about, things I didn't even want to remember. I felt my stomach drop as I read through the letter, a sense of dread filling me from head to toe. How had they found out? Who was doing this? The questions flooded my mind, and I couldn't stop them. Each answer seemed more impossible than the last. It was when I reached the final line that my breath caught in my throat. You think you've been hiding, but I see you. I've always seen you. And now, I'm closer than you think. The words echoed in my mind as I stared at the letter, unable to tear my eyes away. A chill crept up my spine, and I couldn't help but look around, half expecting someone to be standing right behind me, watching me in the same way the letter described. But no one was there. I threw the letter away, convinced it was just another sick joke. But when I got home that evening, there it was again. The feeling. The cold, unsettling sensation that someone was watching me from the shadows. I checked every window, every door, but there was nothing. Nothing except the gnawing, growing sense of unease that had begun to swallow me whole. The next day, I received another letter. This time, it was different. The letter didn't describe my life. It didn't mention anything I had done or seen. Instead, it spoke of my future, my movements, the choices I would make in the coming days, and the paths I would take. The letter had become a prediction, an eerie glimpse into what was yet to come. Tomorrow, it said, you will take a different route to work. You will meet someone you've never seen before, and they will look at you as if they know you. You will wonder how they knew your name, and you will question everything. Don't be afraid. You're not the first one. The words blurred before my eyes. My pulse raced. I could feel my stomach twist with fear. How could they know? How could they possibly know what I was going to do tomorrow? That night, I barely slept, my mind consumed with fear. I had to know who was behind this, what was happening. The constant feeling of being watched, the letters that knew things no one else could know, it was too much. I had to find answers. But the next day, when I left for work, I found myself standing at the edge of the street, frozen. The letter had been right. I was taking a different route to work. I didn't know why, but my feet had led me down a side street I had never walked before. And standing there, on the corner, was a man. He was staring directly at me, his gaze unblinking. His face was familiar in a way I couldn't place, as if I had seen him somewhere before. And then he spoke. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice soft, almost too calm. "You should be careful." I felt my heart race. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape. But I couldn't. The man took a step forward, and I froze. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my pulse pounding in my ears. The man's eyes never left mine, his gaze piercing through me like he could see every thought I was trying to hide. My mouth went dry, and my legs felt like they might give way beneath me. I wanted to speak, to ask him how he knew, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't know how long we stood there in silence, the world around us seemingly frozen. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on me. The only sound I could hear was the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, but it felt like everything had been swallowed by the tension in the air. Finally, the man took another step forward, his presence unnerving. He didn't seem to notice my discomfort, or maybe he just didn't care. His expression remained unnervingly calm, like he was waiting for something. "Are you lost?" he repeated, but this time his voice carried a weight to it, as if the question held a deeper meaning. I shook my head, trying to regain some control, trying to remind myself that I had to stay calm. But his words from the letter flashed in my mind, unbidden, "Tomorrow, you will take a different route to work." I felt a cold sweat bead on my forehead, my mind scrambling for an explanation. This man, standing here, could he be the one? The one who had written the letters? The one who had been watching me all this time? But how? How could he know? "Who are you?" I managed to croak, the words barely escaping my lips. The man's lips twitched into a faint, almost knowing smile. "I'm someone you should have paid attention to," he said, his voice low, with an eerie calmness. "I've been watching you for a while, just like you've been watching yourself." His words made no sense. Watching myself? I was the one who had been terrified, constantly looking over my shoulder, trying to make sense of these twisted letters. I had never even seen this man before, and yet here he was, standing in front of me like he had been part of my life all along. The smile on his face faded as he took another step closer, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Don't worry. You'll understand soon enough," he said cryptically. "But remember, you're not the only one who's been watched." My stomach churned. This man was dangerous. I could feel it in my bones, in the way he looked at me, like I was some kind of puzzle he was eager to solve. "I don't know what you want, but I'm done with this," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. I tried to step back, to distance myself from him, but something held me in place. It was like my feet were glued to the pavement. The man didn't stop me. He simply watched, his eyes calculating, as though he were studying my every move. The air around us seemed to grow colder, and the street, usually so familiar, now felt alien and threatening. The sounds of the world outside seemed to fade, replaced by a ringing silence that wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket. "You can't run from this," he said softly. "You'll find out soon enough what this is all really about." Then, without another word, he turned and began to walk away, his footsteps muffled by the thick silence. I watched him disappear around the corner, my body frozen in place, still reeling from the encounter. It took me a moment to regain my composure, but when I did, panic surged through me. I had to get out of there. I had to go home, lock the doors, and try to make sense of what was happening. I quickly turned and walked in the opposite direction, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled deep inside me. My heart raced, and my mind was spinning with questions I couldn't answer. What did he mean by "you're not the only one who's been watched"? Who else was involved in this twisted game? And why me? The feeling of being watched was unbearable. It followed me every step I took. As I turned onto my street, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone. Still, the fear gnawed at me, relentless and suffocating. I got home and locked the door behind me, checking the windows, ensuring everything was secure. But the unease didn't fade. It was as though the walls of my apartment had suddenly closed in on me, the silence now deafening. I went through the motions, dropping my keys on the table, changing out my coat, but my mind refused to settle. Then, there it was again, the familiar sound of something scratching at the back of my mind. A sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer. The letter. The one I had received the day before. I rushed to my desk, pulled open the drawer, and grabbed the envelope. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. Inside, the letter was there, just like before. But this time, there was something different about it. The handwriting was the same, but the words were new. I told you that you weren't the only one. And now, you've made the mistake of looking. Now, you'll see what happens when you start paying attention. My breath caught in my throat. It was happening again. The letter knew. It knew everything. I stared at the paper, my thoughts racing. What had I missed? What had I done? And then it hit me, the man. The man who had spoken to me on the street. He had been right. I hadn't just stumbled onto a different route to work that day. He had known where I would go. He had predicted it. My hands shook as I reread the letter. The fear that had been building inside me now threatened to break free, to overtake everything. I had to find out who was behind this, but each passing moment only deepened the mystery. The more I searched for answers, the more questions arose. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on to my sanity, or how much further this nightmare would go. But one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. And I was beginning to wonder if I ever truly had a choice. The darkness outside my windows seemed to creep into the corners of my apartment, twisting everything into something strange. It was late, far too late, but sleep was a distant memory. My mind was racing, cycling through every possible explanation for what was happening to me, yet none of them made sense. The letter. The man. The strange feeling that had been following me for days now, an invisible presence that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. It was as though the walls of my own home had turned against me, suffocating me with their silence. Every shadow in the room seemed to shift, every creak of the floorboards felt like a step too close. I couldn't focus on anything except the feeling of being watched, as if every inch of my life was laid bare for someone to see. I sat at my desk, trying to steady my hands, but they betrayed me. I couldn't think straight. My mind kept spiraling back to the man. What did he mean by "you're not the only one who's been watched"? Was there someone else involved in this twisted game? And why me? What had I done to deserve this kind of attention? I glanced at the clock. It was nearing 3 a.m. I had to get some rest. I couldn't let this madness consume me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. His cold, emotionless stare. I saw his smile, that faint, knowing smile that never quite reached his eyes. It haunted me. With a deep breath, I forced myself to get up from the desk and move to the window. The night outside was quiet, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the image of that man, lurking just beyond the veil of normalcy. I should have been used to it by now, the feeling that something wasn't quite right. But it only seemed to grow more pronounced with every passing moment. As I stared out into the street below, I noticed something strange. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the street lamp. But then, it moved. Slowly, deliberately. My heart skipped a beat as I watched it. The figure was standing under the streetlight, barely visible in the dim glow. At first, I thought it was just someone passing by, maybe someone walking home late at night. But as I focused, I realized it wasn't moving like an ordinary person. The figure was unnaturally still, its posture rigid and tense. It was as though it was waiting for something, or someone. I pulled away from the window, my breath shallow, my mind a whirl of thoughts. Could it be him? Could the man be out there, watching me from the shadows, just waiting for me to make the next move? I tried to dismiss the thought. It was irrational. It had to be. But something in my gut told me I wasn't imagining it. The feeling in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sensation, told me this wasn't normal. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I grabbed my phone from the desk, my hands still trembling as I unlocked it. I scanned through my contacts, then stopped. My finger hovered over the name of my closest friend, Emma. I hadn't spoken to her in days. But I needed someone to talk to. I needed someone to help me make sense of all this. The phone rang once, twice, and then, "Hey, it's Emma. Leave a message after the beep." I cursed under my breath, frustrated by the endless cycle of isolation I found myself trapped in. I wanted to reach out, to tell her everything that was happening, but it felt pointless. I didn't know if she would even believe me. Who would? It wasn't like anyone would think I was being stalked by some shadowy figure who wrote me letters predicting my every move. Suddenly, I heard a sound from outside. A soft tap. Almost like the faintest knock on glass. My heart stopped. The noise was coming from the window. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. I slowly turned, my body stiff with fear, and cautiously approached the window again. I didn't want to look, didn't want to face whatever was out there, but I couldn't resist. It was like some sick part of me needed to know, needed to see if the nightmare I was living in was real or just in my mind. I peered through the blinds, my fingers trembling as I pulled them apart just enough to get a clear view. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched the street below, but the figure was gone. Just like that. No sign of it, no trace of its existence. For a moment, I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe it had been nothing. Maybe I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen it. And I wasn't crazy. I took a step back from the window, trying to steady myself. What was happening to me? Was this all in my head? Or was there something, or someone out there, pulling the strings of my life like some twisted puppet master? My mind was spiraling again. I had to get out. I had to do something to break free from this suffocating sense of dread. I grabbed my coat and rushed for the door, but just as my hand touched the handle, there was a knock. Soft at first, then more insistent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned, my breath shallow as I approached the door. I couldn't believe it. Was this really happening? Was someone out there? I pressed my ear against the door, straining to listen. There was no one. No sound. Nothing. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. A deep, unsettling silence followed. I stood there, my mind racing, feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. What was real anymore? Was it the letter? The man? The figure outside? Or was it just my own fear playing tricks on me? I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the door, retreating to the corner of my apartment, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to calm down, to think. But it was hard to think straight when it felt like the world around me was slowly unraveling. The knock. The figure. The letter. They all felt like pieces of a puzzle, but the pieces weren't fitting together. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. But I was running out of time. And the worst part was, I didn't know who or what I was running from. The hours dragged on, each minute heavier than the last. My mind was in chaos, but the apartment felt too still. The silence pressed in on me like a tangible thing, almost suffocating. The knocks had stopped, but my pulse hadn't slowed. I could still feel them, those unseen eyes, watching from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light. I couldn't stay here any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. The weight of everything, the letter, the figure, the strange presence, was too much. But where could I go? The thought of stepping outside seemed just as terrifying. What if the man was out there, waiting for me? Or worse, what if this was all a trap? I paced back and forth in the dim room, my steps echoing like loud crashes in the silence. My mind raced from one thought to the next, jumping from one possible explanation to another. I thought about the letter again. The detailed descriptions, the way it spoke about me as if it knew me better than I knew myself. How could anyone know so much? I couldn't make sense of it, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. The worst part was the idea that this might not be a random act. What if I was being followed? What if there was someone out there with an agenda, someone who had been studying me all this time, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known? My phone buzzed suddenly, cutting through the tension. I jumped, startled by the sound. My hand shook as I grabbed it from the desk, expecting a message from Emma, some kind of reassurance. But when I looked at the screen, it was a text from an unknown number. "I know you saw me." The message was short, cold, and sent a chill down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. This had to be him, the man from the letter. But how did he have my number? How did he know I was awake? The logical part of me wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself it was a prank. But the rest of me, instinct, fear, paranoia, knew better. I stared at the phone, my mind spinning. The message seemed so simple, but the weight of it was suffocating. I wasn't sure what to do next. I could reply, confront him. But that only seemed to play into his hand. I wasn't even sure who he was, much less what he wanted. I couldn't keep running in circles. I needed to act. I had to find answers. I walked over to the kitchen, trying to calm myself with the mundane task of boiling water for tea. The familiar rhythm of filling the kettle, the sound of water splashing into the pot, these small actions gave me a false sense of normalcy. But every second was tainted by the feeling that something wasn't right. The kettle clicked off, and I poured the steaming water into a cup, trying to steady my hands. I was desperate for some kind of distraction, anything to pull me out of the spiraling thoughts. Then I noticed something. There, sitting on the kitchen counter, an envelope. The same type as the one that had arrived days ago, but this one was slightly different. I hadn't seen it come in, hadn't heard anyone knock, hadn't heard the faintest sound of paper sliding under the door. It was just there, sitting in plain sight. I froze. My stomach twisted into a knot. How was this possible? I hadn't even heard the door open. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But no one was there. The apartment was empty, the silence thick and oppressive. The envelope was addressed to me, but there was no return address. No name. No indication of who had sent it. I stood there for a long moment, my fingers hovering above it, afraid to touch it, as if somehow the act of opening it would make everything worse. But then, against every instinct telling me not to, I reached for the envelope. My hand shook as I tore it open, the paper crinkling under my fingers. Inside, there was another letter. The handwriting was the same as before, neat, controlled, almost too perfect. It was as if the writer had taken great care in crafting each word. I'm watching you, but you already know that. The question is, do you think you can escape? I felt the blood drain from my face as I read the words. This was real. Whoever this was, they weren't just toying with me. They knew my every move. They knew where I lived. And they weren't going to stop until they had whatever they wanted. The room seemed to spin, the edges of my vision blurring. I staggered back, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to throw the letter across the room, to destroy any trace of it. But I couldn't. I couldn't let it go. The letter felt like the only clue I had. It was a message, a direct communication from someone who knew too much. I pressed my hand to my forehead, trying to collect myself, but the panic was rising in me again. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just some sick joke. Someone was in control, and I was the puppet. The figure outside earlier flashed in my mind, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. What if the person who sent these letters was still out there, watching me, just waiting for the right moment to confront me? I couldn't sit in this apartment any longer. I needed to get out. But where could I go? Who could I trust? Emma was too far away to be of any help, and even if I told her everything, would she believe me? Would anyone believe me? Suddenly, I realized there was something else in the envelope. A small slip of paper, folded carefully. I unfolded it, heart pounding as I saw the address scrawled in the same neat handwriting. It was my old house. The place I'd left years ago. Why would someone want me to go back there? What could possibly be waiting for me? I didn't have a choice anymore. I had to go. I had to find out what was going on before it was too late. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the small slip of paper trembling in my hands. The address. My old house. Why was this person telling me to go there? Had they been watching me long enough to know that it was the place I had tried so hard to forget? The thought of going back there made my stomach churn, but what choice did I have? Whoever was behind these letters, whoever was watching me, had taken the game to a whole new level. The message was clear. If I wanted answers, I had to face the past. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The night was thick with stillness, but I could feel the tension creeping into the air. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet seemed magnified in the silence. I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling slightly as I shoved the note into my pocket. I didn't want to think about it any longer. I had to go, now. There was no time to waste. I grabbed my jacket, throwing it over my shoulders, but as I reached for the door handle, the faint sound of something scraping against the wood made my heart stop. For a split second, everything went completely still. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned to look around the room. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the quiet, oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the apartment. But my nerves were on edge now. I knew better than to ignore the sensation, the feeling that someone was still watching me. Even as I stood there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, the silence felt too heavy. Too wrong. I forced myself to focus. I couldn't waste any more time. I had to leave. I needed answers, even if I was too afraid to find them. I stepped out into the hallway, locking the door behind me with a trembling hand. The hallway was dimly lit, shadows stretching long on the walls. I took one last look around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the quiet, the growing sense that something was waiting for me just around the corner. The elevator ride down felt like it took hours. The faint hum of the machinery was the only sound, and it was enough to drive me mad. Each floor I passed seemed to take me further away from my safe place and deeper into whatever nightmare had begun to unfold. When I reached the lobby, the door opened with a faint squeak, and the sudden gust of cold air hit me like a punch to the chest. The streets outside were bathed in the harsh glow of streetlights, but even that didn't feel comforting. The night felt too still, too empty. I took a deep breath, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I stepped out onto the sidewalk. I knew where I was going, my old house. The place where everything had gone wrong. It had been years since I'd left, but the memories were as vivid as ever. I could almost feel the weight of them pressing on me as I walked through the deserted streets. The further I went, the more the feeling of dread started to build, tightening in my chest like a vice. What was I walking into? What had I gotten myself into? I walked faster, ignoring the cold that crept into my bones, focusing only on the end goal, my old house. As I approached the familiar street, the anxiety in my gut intensified. The house loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette against the night sky. It hadn't changed, not really. The same crooked mailbox, the same cracked driveway, the same overgrown front yard. It all seemed frozen in time, like a memory that refused to fade. I hesitated at the gate, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, drowning out the distant sound of traffic. The house, it didn't feel like it was just a house. It felt like it was watching me, like it remembered me, like it had a claim on me. I pushed the gate open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. With each step toward the front door, I felt the weight of the past pressing on me, dragging me back into the nightmare I had escaped all those years ago. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the doorknob. For a moment, I just stood there, unsure if I was ready to face whatever waited inside. But then the realization hit me. I had no choice. The letters had led me here. Whoever was behind them wanted me to come. I turned the knob, and the door creaked open, revealing the familiar dark interior of the house. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust. The smell of old wood and forgotten memories hit me in a wave, and I nearly gagged. Nothing had changed. The walls still held the echoes of long-lost conversations, and the dim light of the hallway stretched out before me like a tunnel. I stepped inside, my footsteps too loud in the empty house. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and the air seemed to press against my skin. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to remember. But I had to. I had to find out what was going on. I walked through the familiar rooms, each one feeling colder than the last. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for me to return. I paused at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the darkness that stretched above me. The stairs had always felt like they led into another world, a place I could never escape from. The house was silent now, but I could feel something, A presence. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. There was something in the air, something that didn't belong. I took the first step, and then another, slowly climbing the staircase, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. Each step felt heavier, each breath I took more labored. At the top of the stairs, I paused. The door to my old room was open. I hadn't expected that. I approached it, my heart pounding in my chest, the walls closing in on me. There, lying on the floor in the center of the room, was a single object. A broken mirror. It was the last thing I had expected to see. But there it was, its shattered pieces reflecting the dim light in jagged fragments, like 1,000 tiny eyes staring back at me. And then, just as I was about to take a step closer, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, barely audible. But it was there. You're not alone. The words froze me in place. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.